Hello, welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm with Rue Marshall, and we're talking about their upcoming, fairly massive biography of Carlos Castaneda, American Trickster, available from Aura Books. Rue Marshall is a writer and visual artist. Their novel Separate Reality was released in 2006 and received a Landa Award nomination for the Abuse Fiction. Marshall's writing can be found all over the internet, but particularly Salon, N+1 Online, Evergreen Review, Kenyon Review, those types of places. I became familiar with Rue's work actually all the way back, I think in like 2007 when you started writing Carlos Castaneda. When your publicist approached me, I was like, I believe I've already read Rue on Carlos Castaneda, but I've reminded myself it was an article, and now you have a fairly extensive biography coming out that you can get. People can pre-order it. Pre-orders really help authors, and you could order it from Aura Books as well. But I'm just going to start off with the most obvious of questions.
Mm-hmm.
What got you into Carlos Castaneda?
Oh, Lord, the fuck knows. Well, I had read the books when I was much, much younger, and I wrote a novel, the novel that won the award, didn't win the award, it's nominated, and it's a queer crisis of faith novel. That was my little elevator pitch, which of course sold millions of copies. The thing that I found was that Castaneda just kind of kept somehow coming up, in the background of it. I didn't know anything at all about him as a person or who he was, and, almost nobody did. When that book came out, my agent said, you should just do a little short nonfiction thing to help promote the book. And the immediate thought that I had was, well, whatever happened to Carlos Castaneda? I went online. It was February 2006, and I came across a little article in the Pahrump Valley Times, I hope I'm saying that correctly, about the discovery of the skeleton of his adopted daughter and, turns out, girlfriend, Nuri Alexander. And I was like, what? What the fuck? And then I realized, nobody seemed to have really written about this. I soon got in touch with a woman named Amy Wallace, who was the daughter of a very big best-selling 70s writer, Irving Wallace, who had been one of Castaneda's girlfriends. And I talked to her for 3 hours. And after that, I was kind of like, how can you not write about this? The story was so strange. I had the very, very diluted idea that this was going to take 2 or 3 years to write. And it was one of those things where you've spent so much time on it. You're like, well, I can, I'll have to do another year or two because I got to finish this. And it just kept getting weirder and weirder. And, a rabbit hole opened up into a wormhole, which opened up into a lizard hole. And yeah, that is how long it took to get this out.
It's interesting to me when we talk about Castaneda, because I have to remind myself that he's not just a weird occult figure, that he actually was a pretty adroit anthropological, to put it bluntly, scammer.
Yeah.
And was a well-known name in my parents' generation. So I'm a Gen Xer. So my mother knew who he was. But he also, I agree with you, kind of disappeared from popular consciousness for a long time. Seems to come up periodically now and then today, but very periodically. Why do you think it is that he was such an important figure in one time period, and then by the aughts had been kind of almost memory hold?
Well, I would push back a little bit on that because I think it depends on whose memory.
Mm.
Because if spend a bunch of time, in, New Age stuff, he's there, just, and this is, no shade on any of these people, but say, you listen to somebody like Tara Brach, she like quotes him, all the time. I'm like, Tara, really, must you? So there are certain places where he's quite, it's quite alive. And I would say, though, most alive, back in people's memories. And even and I found this also, because I really had not thought about him for quite a long time, but I keep finding that there were things that was like, oh my God, that is where that came from. That is where that idea that has been sitting in my head all of this time originated. There are a bunch of ways to, go into this. One is that there's something that, his first great debunker was a guy named Richard DeMille, who was the son of Cecil B. DeMille. And he has a phrase, he talks about the invisibility of scientific scorn. I think he says scientific scorn. And so, although, people in academia much more slowly than is remembered now, began to back away from Carlos, and this, it took 5 years before there was really any kind of public takedown of him. And that takedown took a while. But there's a kind of quality of embarrassment, I think, about it, that people don't want to just kind of own up to what a big deal he actually was. And even, I would argue the influence that he had on the direction that anthropology has taken. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting because Castaneda is still known, and if you ever hang out in occult circles or New Age circles, or like with the Lemites, he gets brought up. But to remind people, he was influential at Berkeley and had, some pretty prominent sociological defenders at Berkeley.
Can I jump in there a minute? I think at UCLA is really where that's where he was. He was published in Berkeley, but yeah. Do you mind my jumping in here, or
no? Go ahead.
Be a good guest and listen to the question. Castaneda's champion at UCLA, and this was something I learned very quickly when I started to talk to people at UCLA, was a guy named Harold Garfinkel, who, most people have never heard of, but in sociology, people have heard of him. And also, this is a whole other thing, in transgender studies, people have heard of him. He was the founder of a movement, or I guess you call it a movement or a school, called ethnomethodology, which had, I wouldn't say a stranglehold, but a huge presence, say, from at least, say from San Diego up to Santa Barbara in California, in academia, in the first half of the 70s, and perhaps after that. And Castaneda was his favorite student, because what Castaneda was doing was he was, at least Garfinkle thought, proving his theories. The book is called American Trickster, because he was a trickster. It's a kind of a complicated question, but one of the primary tricks was to reflect back to these academic mentors exactly what it was to hear, and to show how vulnerable everybody is to that. And Garfinkel, if there's one, because the character, we should just say that if people don't know, Castaneda's books are about his supposed encounters with a shaman. He didn't call him a shaman, he called him a brujo, named Don Juan, who was supposedly a Yaqui, who, they took mushrooms and peyote and datura, but more importantly, really, was that the whole kind of philosophy of how to view the world was being revealed to him. And when these, very brilliant academics at UCLA and elsewhere, not just at UCLA, found in this indigenous shaman their own teachings, they were quite into it.
It is interesting the amount of different things that you find in Castaneda's use of Don Juan. Like, you point out that you might find stuff from the National Enquirer in an account in one of his accounts by Don Juan, but you also might find stuff from C.S. Lewis and Wittgenstein. And like, do you think the sheer range of what he was, magpieing about gave it some validity, and gave it some validity for different academics who could see kind of whatever they wanted, because you were getting all sorts of little nuggets of things that you already believed in this like shaman package? Was it a flood the zone tactic, to use modern unfortunate parlance? What was going on with that?
Well, one thing is that plagiarism is an art, or it can be an art. Most people are pretty sloppy about, I don't know, but Carlos was not. Rarely was he sloppy. And Castaneda, he studied art. He studied visual art back when he was in Peru. And I don't know if I really even get too explicit about this in the book, but one of the ways that I think of these books is as a kind of collage project. And he had this kind of intelligence where he could see, there's this Buddhist text that says this, and there's this, and in Husserl, and he had he was very talented. He knew how to fuse this into something that was quite compelling, and he was often also taking other people's ideas but reframing them in a way that made them very popularly accessible. There's also, he wrote 10 books, although most people usually, at least I did, stopped at book 4. And there's a trajectory. He's not pulling on everything at the same time. At the beginning, it's much more kind of limited and kind of more highbrow. The National Enquirer stuff kind of comes in. After he was no longer really in academia, he drew from other sources. So, the earlier books are much more coherent and cogent in that way.
It reminds me of, at the end of the first book, there's a structural analysis, and I've even tried to read it. It reads so incredibly dryly that it's almost like he's making fun of academia. What do you make of that?
You cut out there for a second, okay. Derek. Were you saying the structural analysis?
The structural analysis at the end of the first book, which almost feels like it's almost a parody of academic writing.
Well, that's my take on it. But it's, I got different, people had really different views on it. And there's some kind of, mystery, deep in that. Joyce Carol Oates, who was, the first person to publicly say in a letter to the editor of the New York Times, am I the only person who thinks these are actually novels? She thought that the structural analysis, which it comes at the end of the first book, which is just a compelling novel, in my, and then at the end of it, there's all of this, what reads to me is basically academic gobbledygook, stuck on at the end. I think she's right. I think it was a parody. Whether or not Harold Garfinkel understood it that way, I don't know. I don't know.
One of the things that your book exposes to about Castaneda is stuff that I actually believed that I discovered that was wrong. So, for example, I believed he was Brazilian.
Okay. There's a reason for that. There's a reason you believed that. Right. He would be very happy to hear that, Derek. It's crazy. Can we talk about the Brazil thing?
Yeah, let's talk about it because I was like, wait, why do I believe he's Brazilian? I don't think I've ever even I don't even know where I got that from, but I definitely thought it. Like,
You got it from Carlos. He went through UCLA, got a PhD, claiming he was from Brazil, spoke not a word of Portuguese. And that's, there's a very, very dark side of Castaneda, which I think we'll get to later. But there's also a part where you kind of got to hand it to him, because what he's doing is he keeps, he arrives in the United States in 1951. And my sense of it is he just kind of keeps pushing to see what he can get away with, in the project of, reinvention, which, it's up to a point that's not that unusual. But he kept pushing the envelope, and the envelope just kept getting crazy, crazy fucking big, to the point where he becomes one of the best-selling authors in the 1970s. And it's so revelatory that these, some brilliant theorists and so forth at UCLA really knew jack shit about what was going on, anywhere the other side of the Rio Grande. There's stuff that I have in the book that just, reveals, it's kind of, from today's point of view, I hope, or from my point of view today, you're kind of flabbergasting how little they knew. But yeah, and he enrolls in, like the first year he's at UCLA, he enrolls in beginning Spanish, which he's fluent in, and he gets all these credits there from taking Spanish class. So, that takes a certain level of performance to be able to perform not knowing Spanish when it's your native tongue. But yeah, the Brazil thing, the most important thing though here is he's from Peru. Mm-hmm. And he spent his career being from Brazil, being from Mexico. He could be from Italy if you wanted to, kind of pretty much anywhere but Peru. And I was like, what's that about? Should I go into what it's about?
Yeah, what is it about?
What is it about? I don't know. I don't know how far did you get in the book, Derek? I know you haven't had it for that long.
I've read.
The end of this or not? So
I mean, I got to the part where you talked about. I don't know if this is the answer, but you talked about his father's relationship to the third way / Social Democratic Party, the Arepists,
and the apprenticed.
Like yeah.
No, there's a much darker thing.
Okay.
And I heard this rumor. Well, I'll tell you who told me. Maria Rana, the writer, told me that, and she was like, I believe I am Castaneda's birth name is Cesar Arana. He's from Cajamarca, Peru, which is in the north. It's the town where the first encounter between the Spanish and the Incas happened. Pizarro, garroted Atahualpa in the town square, like a block and a half from the house in which Castaneda grew up. And the Arana family is very interesting because they're an infamous character in Peruvian history named Julio Cesar Arana, who at the beginning of the 20th century, I think most people who are hearing this probably have maybe at least know about Fitzcarraldo, which is based on a guy named Carlos Fitzcarraldo, who had a little empire in the Peruvian Amazon. He was superseded by Julio Cesar Arana, who basically established a private slave state in the Peruvian Amazon that was, created fabulous wealth. And he was one of the richest folk in the world from the rubber trade. And the rubber trade was based on, calling it slavery is almost, kind of too gentle. because it was just a system of terror and torture. Because what they would do is they would get in, there's no kind of organized structure. So they, kidnap indigenous people and will, torture them until their family brings in the rubber. In 1912, I'm in a kind of nerdy space, so I can talk about this stuff, I think. Roger Casement, who is the figure who revealed what was going on in King Leopold's Congo, was sent. Rumors started to reach the United Kingdom, and the British had an interest in Arana's company, and these horrific rumors or stories began to get to London, and Casement was sent over to investigate. And they tried to pull a number on him, but he found out the story. And in 1912, this was exposed, and it was an enormous kind of worldwide scandal. And the fortunes of the Arana family collapsed. They would later come back, but that's a whole other thing we don't need to get into. And yeah, I spent many years trying to figure out what the connection is. I make the case and am convinced, although I could never find out exactly what the connection was, that the Arana family that Carlos grew up in Cajamarca seems to have been clearly financially dependent on Julio Cesar. Because the same month that collapses, you can see in the records in the municipal archives in Cajamarca that Castaneda's or the Arana family in Cajamarca, they're suddenly without money, and it was very interesting to read Marie Arana's memoir, because it's this thing that was completely buried in Peru. And there's something called the mark of the Arana, which meant both the marks that were left on the backs of the indigenous slaves who were being whipped in the Amazon, but it also meant the shame of the Aranas. And my belief, I think there were multiple things that Castaneda was running away from. There were other things as well, including, a girl he got pregnant. But the determination to not be Peruvian, and to erase that entire history is very strong. And I also think it's coded into the later books that he tells the story. The later books, some people may disagree with me. They're really weird. The first 4 books read, they read well. I think the first one is by far the best. But there's stuff that is so entangled and strange later on that I think you have to learn how to encode them. So yeah. But hence Brazil.
So why did he take his maternal grandfather's name when he came to America?
That's a really good question, and one that I cannot I don't know. There's almost nothing known about that the original Carlos Castaneda. Carlos took away the tilde, the mark, so it became Castaneda for the North American audience. When he gets to the United States, he keeps kind of playing with it, and shifting the name and stuff, and that I think it's in 1958. That's what he lands on and sticks with that, and also that he publishes his first poem, under that name. So yeah.
You do note one of the ironies of his name, and I mean, because Arana can mean, with the tilde it means spider, but without the tilde it means like trick, I think.
It's one of the meanings. It's in the big thick dictionary. It's one of the meanings. Yeah.
It's not a term that when I lived in Mexico I ever heard, but what do you mean? I mean, what kind of irony do you see in that?
I don't know. It's also his he was born on Christmas Day. And that's something I was like, oh, that can't be true, but it is true. It's in the birth certificate. And so his name is, Cesar Salvador Arana. So it's Savior, at least can be glossed as Savior Trickster. That gets into weird stuff because Carlos, made a lot. He had a, tremendous imagination, made a lot of stuff up, but he was also, I guess the word would be superstitious. He believed very much in the power of naming. He would give people names, in order to place them in a kind of symbolic world, that he was controlling. So he had to know this. And he also, of course, had to know because he did study anthropology, the anthropological literature on tricksters. So to what extent that kind of reinforced, his own narrative of self, magical narrative of self, I suspect it did. Who knows what really goes on in his head, but.
Your book got me thinking a lot about Harold Garfinkel. Harold Garfinkel.
Did you know of his work before, or?
I did, but mostly
we've never met before. Just saying.
Yeah, no, I did, but mostly through mentions around Castaneda and as a footnote in things I studied when I was studying anthropology in college, which I did as an undergrad, which is actually simultaneously in the late 90s counterculture and as a cautionary tale in anthropology. I learned Carlos Castaneda, but
you did. It was talked about in that way.
Yeah, it was, but barely.
Where were you? Can I ask?
I was at Georgia State at the time. So, and it was. I got the feeling even as an undergrad that it was embarrassing. It was like, oh, it was the dumb 60s and 70s, and people were fools back then. It was kind of the way it was taught to me. But I was thinking about, Garfinkel's use of the breaching experiments, which you bring up in your book. And what is weird about this is this, like, if you think about what the Don Juan book is, it kind of feels like almost like a meta breaching experiment. So I wondered, like, how much did the Castaneda know about Garfinkel's work before it was a student? Did maybe none?
They meet pretty early on. I think, I'm off the top of my head, I think it's in 1962 that they meet. There were multiple people told me, and it's just, there's stuff about him that you're just like, it's kind of great. Everyone was like, oh, I introduced him to Garfinkel. And he would let everybody think they were the one, who had done it. And so, yeah, he was completely immersed in it. This was the, Garfinkel's office was on the third floor, anthropology's on the fourth floor, or the other way around. Everybody, who knew him at UCLA, talked about that relationship. And that's the same period when Garfinkel is working on his really one book that, did make it still has an impact on studies in ethnomethodology. At the same time, Castaneda is writing the teachings of Don Juan, and spending, all this time at Garfinkel's feet, so it's in the books. It's in the books, and it's so bald. It's just, it's crazy because, Garfinkel, if you were to sum him up, he says, reality is an agreed upon description, which, in some ways is, I think, clearly true, and maybe seemed more radical, in 1962, 1965, 1967 than it does now. Those words come out of Don Juan's mouth. And, Garfinkel, I mean, DeMille, who was, the first big debunker, I think he kind of ended up thinking that Garfinkel knew all along that it was a hoax or figured it out. I part ways with him on that. I don't think he did, but, from what I've read in the archives and from talking to people who knew him, I think he felt genuinely, horrified and betrayed when he figured it out. But it took him a long time to figure it out, probably by, until at least 1976. Did I go off? I don't know if I even stayed on your question there.
No,
I was like, bah.
No. I mean, it makes a lot of sense because I was going back and forth reading this, thinking about it. I've read DeMille's work about how much did Garfinkel actually know. I mean, when we think about what the first Time Magazine Expose is in 1973, but we don't really get the full debunking until 1976 to 1978. And it is wild, but it's very post facto, in that when
it's
people,
wild. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's wild that like when people start debunking Castaneda and his story starts unraveling, people act like it was obvious, but it clearly wasn't obvious.
It clearly was not obvious. No, but I think that's like maybe the most important thing in the book is that when you have, a group of people or a little community, which is, the world of anthropologists in Southern California, and people have like invested their reputations in something and have been personally, Carlos didn't as much fool people, he seduced people. He was an incredibly, charming and fun guy. And you get all these people to ride on that wagon. It's very, very difficult for somebody to be the first person to say, no. And I would say if I have any kind of, whatever message, I don't know if I believe in messages, but what he does, because later on, we should at least mention that he becomes a full-on cult leader later. And he gets people to, believe that they are going to, travel with him into infinity. But the methods that he employs to do that, I don't think they're any different. Maybe they're a little bit more, developed than what he was doing at UCLA. It's very easy to point, let's just say, I don't know, people in MAGA or something, to be like, how can you believe this? How can you believe this? This is so totally disconnected to reality. But if you're the people who are your community and whose, social goodwill you depend on, all believe something, what Carlos knows, and what I think every cult leader knows, is that emotions and the need to belong are going to override reason. And that's why it took so long. He had, not as important as Garfinkle, but, the foreword to the teachings is written by Walter Goldschmidt, who went on to become the head of the American Anthropological Association. So, you have to, think of it in terms of who wants to say that the head of the American Anthropological Association, was a dupe, and who wants to say that they themselves are a dupe. It's very hard for me to say, well, I was wrong about something. I'm trying to work on it. I'm trying to be like, if I realize I was wrong about something, to say it. But most people don't. And that's not because people are crazy or weird or stupid. It's because they're human, I think.
Right. It's deeply embarrassing not just to individuals, but if we think about Sonora Gate, it's deeply embarrassing to the institutions. Like, when you're asking Ralph Bills, who was the person who sponsored Castaneda for UCLA,
at first, at very, very first,
at the very beginning, to apologize for a mistake, and I'm just like, that also seems a bit much, to be completely fair.
I want
Like,
to say something for, I mean, the late,
mm,
I think he died quite a while ago, but Beals was one of the very few people who acknowledged a mistake. But I
mm,
had, and again, I don't want to, throw shade on people who accomplished, important work in other fields, but Robert Edgerton was he had a joint appointment in psychology and anthropology at
mm.
UCLA. Um, and he was on the dissertation committee. His signature is there. And I never got to spoke to him in person, but I corresponded with him, and he completely, he denied. It's like, no, I didn't know him at all. It's like, he's like, he came up to me once in the hallway, and I told him to go away, or something like that. It's not true, but I don't think he was lying. I think that he rewrote his memory because it was, yeah, I guess like you're saying, too embarrassing to acknowledge. And
Yeah.
most people, and that's still, I mean, let's just go there. I mean, my book was under contract for 3 years with University of California, and honey, I got some pushback. Like, who are you? Who are you, this weird artist, novelist person, to be questioning us anthropologists? I can't tell you who wrote those reports, because they're anonymous. Um, but that was one of, reasons I had to part way with them. And I'm like, really, guys? It's 50 years later. 50 years later, but you're still not that kind of institutional loyalty. That did surprise me. That did surprise me.
Yeah. Actually, it kind of surprises me. I guess so. Your book begins with the hints of some of the darker stuff.
Yeah.
I it is interesting to put the timeline together.
Mm.
I guess to get to the timelines, we have to talk about the Chocmuls or the Winds, who
Mm.
eventually get known as the Witches or the Brujas. Um, uh, when does that start? Like, when do these female characters start showing up in Castaneda's orbit?
Well, they actually start showing up very early, but it's very small at
Mm,
first. I would, and the basically simultaneous with when he starts writing the teachings of Don Juan in 1960, he kind of recruits his first. It's a long. I don't need to go into the whole convoluted story, but there are two, young women who, enter his orbit and will eventually, dedicate most of their lives to him. Sometime in, by the early 70s, he starts referring to them as the winds, and it becomes a very elaborate, kooky, say it's kooky, sorry, it is kooky, Carlos lovers, mythology about the winds. And, I was mentioning before about the importance of naming in
mhm,
Castaneda. He also, I found there to be this thing which I call the sounds like principle, where he'll take a word and kind of morph over to the next word. And the winds in the 1970s, by the late 70s, they become the witches. And up until the mid 80s, it's a pretty small enclosed group. Mid to late 80s, it starts expanding, and there are all these other kind of mythical entities, and they're basically, it's everybody who's in his world gets to also, on some level or another, be a mythical character,
mm.
which, it's kind of like cosplay. There certainly seems to be quite a fun aspect to it. But then the fun, starts getting darker and darker. Should we go to the dark darkness?
Yeah, let's go to the dark
Let's go,
darkness because
let's go
several
to the,
people disappear. So,
yeah. Well, in the space between book 4 and book 5, what happens is that the character Carlos, basically jumps off a cliff and flies and goes into the abyss and whatever, and then you're surprised later on that, oh, he's still there for more books, because Castaneda had to keep writing books. What else is he going to do? Um, but there becomes this, mythology that Carlos is not going to die. He is going to turn into a ball of light and descend into the heavens as Don Juan did. And in the 90s, there begins to be more and more kind of explicit talk. There's kind of this way that about suicide and talk about how we're gonna leave together and we're gonna navigate infinity and so forth and so on are woven in. And I go to some length to show that in the book. Carlos dies in April 1998, and immediately thereafter, 5 women disappear, including 2 of the witches and a woman named Amalia Marquez and a woman named Kylie Lundahl, who, I don't know how much you want to go into the magic stuff. She was one of the chakmuls, which are these, in Mesoamerica, they're these statuary that you'll see, and Carlos gave it this whole other, meaning. And as I mentioned a while ago, the thing that made me think, how can you not write this book? I know it's going to take 20 years, but was that the skeleton of one of them was found in Death Valley. And all indications are that whether or not they all committed suicide together or not, they left because there was a group consensus that was what they were going to do. And I would say the deep reason for that is because, these cult leader guys, they do not want to be alone, even, in death. He couldn't just have an ordinary, banal death. It had to be something, create this mythical thing. And I believe that 5 women died because of that.
Yeah, that is not dark.
I love me a double negative, Derek. Just give me a triple or
I do I find that the cult aspect of Castaneda is actually a little bit I'm not going to say under discussed, because people clearly discuss it, but
you're cutting out a little bit. Could you?
I'm not going to say it was under discussed because people clearly discuss it, but it kind of loses its narrative impulse despite how interesting it is, compared to the stuff at UCLA and the publications at Berkeley. Do you think it's because it doesn't involve implicating elite people, or most people don't know about it? Why?
Almost no one knows about it, in my experience. I don't want to toot my horn, but I'm one of the major reasons that I wasn't the first person to know about this story or to write about this story, but I'm one of the major reasons that some people do know about it, because of, I think, the article that you read many years ago in Salon. And this group, it's called Clear Green, which was the corporation Carlos set up, not his most imaginative naming thing. They're still out there. They're, teaching workshops, and did we talk about, we haven't talked about Tensegrity.
No, we haven't.
That's a something. They were really into the martial arts from the get-go. Castaneda was, had them studying karate. What they start doing, late 80s, early 90s, is teaching their own martial arts practice, which they call Tensegrity, which is a term they grabbed from Buckminster Fuller, because, as you were saying, let's take from everywhere. I don't know why Buckminster Fuller, but it didn't. Anyway, and they claimed, absurdly, that it would have been passed down by 25 generations of Toltec shamans. And if you did it, really, really assiduously and perfectly, if there's a huge emphasis, you have to do everything perfectly, impeccably is the word they use, you can, rearrange reality and you don't have to die.
Hmm.
I think it's just a lot. I think it's a lot to for people to hold into their heads. So, but nobody, when Nuri's skeleton was found, no other newspaper picked up that story. Nobody, no, it went nowhere. I think it's part of it. It's just too fucking weird.
You know what I found interesting? I used to live up the street from, literally, but about 45 minutes up the street from the Nawabian compound. I don't know if you know about the Nawabians. They were an Afrocentric, they were an Afrocentric cult that came to fame because they had some involvement from Wesley Snipes in the late 90s.
Wow.
They denied that slavery happened. They had a similar theory about white people to the Nation of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things they did as outreach was teach an esoteric form of karate.
Interesting.
And I encountered them locally a lot. And when you mentioned that and Castaneda, I was like, that's interesting that it actually was several groups in the 80s and 90s doing this, and I've never really seen it talked about anywhere, about the weird overlaps between occult culture and 80s and 90s martial arts culture, and because I think it's there. And clearly, if
I think it's also just kind of in the air in the 70s. I don't know about this group, but it's when Bruce Lee is becoming a big phenomena, and there's it doesn't matter too much, but Castaneda had a kind of a tangential exposure to that. My take on it is you got to give people something to do. In a cult, there has to be something, and my guess with Carlos is he was riffing on Gurdjieff a bit, because he went and watched the Gurdjieff movement and the dances, and he made fun of it. It was like, oh, that's totally stupid, and then 10, 15 years later, people start doing these movements, and they're like, oh yeah, this kind of reminds me. I don't know much about the Gurdjieff stuff, but people, you have to keep in cults. People need to be kept really busy, and some of them do that by hanging out, recruiting people, and I think this was just what they came up with.
I was also thinking about the gender dynamics of Castaneda and what's going on there, because there's a lot of associating with women, but also a lot of particularly, it seems to me, by the 80s, but maybe you would say it was always there. There's kind of a machista thing going through. What do you think? What were Castaneda's ideas about gender that were explicit? What do you think we can draw implicitly? There's a lot to think about there.
Wow, a deep, vortex and or abyss. I think really deeply conflicted stuff. People, his best friend in the 1950s, back to the 1950s, this guy named Alan Morrison was like, I always thought Carlos was suppressed gay, and he didn't think that he'd ever kind of done anything with it, but he found him to just have a certain kind of mannerisms or presentation that did not seem like straight guy, California 1950s. Maybe that's all wrong, but Castaneda was a compulsive seducer. In who knows, thousands of women. My sense of it is that it is a compulsion, that there is this deep need to, seduce in order to control. He obviously had a very, kind of messed up internal relationship, to his mother. So it's weird because the books, especially the early books, there's all this, stuff about the warrior, there is this definite kind of, a certain kind of spiritual macho thing. When you get to the 90s, though, they're doing all of this kind of, gender play, in, because they have this thing called the source theater, and they put on these little plays for each other, and there's a lot of curious kind of gender bending stuff going on there. So I'm sorry if that answer is nebulous, because I don't really have a clear thing about that, but I would not say that he was somebody who was like all confident in being a man. And we have to say, because the thing that most people know Garfinkel for, in my experience now, is it's not called Agnes, but it's known as Agnes. We know about Agnes. We know about Agnes, which is the first sociological study of a transgender person that Garfinkel publishes in 1967, which is at the height of his involvement, with Carlos, and he uses that as an example of how, reality is constructed and how we construct the world through talking about it and through creating stories and bringing people into our stories. And all of that is very parallel what Don Juan is. I mean, it's not talking about gender. It's not talking about gender, but he is saying, you can recreate the world through through talk.
Yeah, there's I mean, from the standpoint of someone trying to understand like these cultural phenomenon in kind of a modern left-wingish context, he's kind of a baffling figure, whether or not he's progressive or regressive in any meaningful sense. It's very hard to like map even.
He's not progressive.
No. I was going to ask you a little bit too, because his playful, in quotations, child nickname was El Negro, which just means the black, but is
that's a deep, tricky thing,
right?
Because I'm a gringo. I went to Peru, and was like, well, did that carry a kind of negative connotations? And then no. But you look at pictures of him with there's some mystery in here. He's darker skinned than anybody in his family. Whether he is, and this is not something I go into in the book because I can't prove it, but whether he's really his father's son, I think there is reason to question that. He fiercely, at the same time that he's, thought of as this person who is, bringing indigenous, knowledge to Western people, he fiercely identifies himself in the books as a Westerner, repeatedly as a Westerner. And then, there's so many kind of layers to this. The supposed indigenous knowledge that he, is making into these books that sell, tens of millions of copies is, it's Husserl. How do you say that? And Nietzsche and Sartre. It's phenomenology. So I think his relationship to to race it's very conflicted. I mean, he said in private pretty appalling things. Not that he was I wouldn't say that it's racist, but there's this conversation, that I have in the book where somebody is, it's like this early 70s talking about, the whatever the conditions of black people in the ghetto, and he says, well, the ghetto is just in your mind. If you don't, you create your own ghetto. And I'm like, really? To the extent, I mean, basically, he did not believe in politics, but to the extent that he had them, they were right wing. He got with people who were right wingers. Better. He certainly was opposed to any kind of thing like welfare would have been abhorrent. To him, if he saw you giving money to somebody on the street, you would have been exiled for that. Because there's it's a weird kind of like almost Ayn Rand streak there of self-reliance. And the irony is that I think that probably 90+% of the people who read his books, I don't know, had very, very different politics than that.
How were his politics different than his immediate family? I mean, this is what
well, that's his because you were mentioning that earlier. His father was a leading member of the Aprista party, which was a movement in Peru in I don't know when it starts, but in the 1930s and 1940s, that was not Marxist, but as a radical revolution movement led by a guy named Victor Raúl de la Torre. His dad was one of the top lieutenants in Cajamarca. Castaneda despised his father. He considered him to be a kind of a weak failure, and this is probably in part because the family has to go into hiding. And I think because of their going into hiding and the mother having, we're really getting into it, the mother having health conditions, I suspect that in Carlos's mind that he held the father responsible for the mother's death. And so the whole kind of ideology of, community coming together and, raising the people up, his whole thing is no. The revolution is not a thing of the masses. It's the thing of the lone soul person all on their own.
I mean, there are people who I think of like Alejandro Jodorowsky actually has a lot of left wingers like him, but I'm like, yeah, but he has actually a very right wing, almost aristocratic view of like how you transcend society and this, that, and the other. And I find that element to Castaneda somewhat interesting because a lot of his fans in the 60s and maybe even in the 80s and 90s would have been relative progressives in the American context.
Totally.
And yet I also think, you have the pink diaper baby problem. Many a socialist academic produces a neoliberal child. So it's an interesting thing for me to think about with him because it seems like he is fundamentally out of step with the people he's seducing in academia. And even when it comes to like American New Agers and occultists, they're not going to think of that until relatively recently. A lot of them would not have thought of themselves as openly right wing. I think a lot of them would now, but like, it's just it's an interesting like cultural problem, and it's one I think a lot about. So
it's interesting to trace these kind of subcurrents that I think, and the thing I have been thinking about that I think maybe parallels what you're talking about is the whole, Maha movement. Because there's this thing that's, certainly not, unique to Castaneda, that, disease is in your mind. He didn't he didn't seem to have believed in germ theory. It's like we create. Look, we do create certain things through consciousness. We create the nation state through an agreed upon consciousness. We create, money and so forth. I think we create gender, whatever. We don't create, disease, that way. But there's this kind of irrationality. I don't think irrationality is always bad. And I can't say I've teased all this out or have a whole theory about this, but the Castaneda is certainly a significant figure, in bringing that in. It's like this, fuck you to the man, fuck you to authority. We can change the world by changing consciousness, but in there, there's also this anti-authoritarianism toward, now it's, the CDC or, them doctors who want you to get, vaccinated or whatever. Anyway, it's sketchy on my end, but.
It's interesting, to think about Robert Kennedy and Castaneda together is not an obvious thing, but I think about this today. You point out in your book how much Castaneda was pretending to be quasi-indigenous or a peasant, particularly early on in the 60s, while he would probably recoil for that in any native Spanish context. And I think about this too, with this need for this kind of I was gonna say identity. I should actually just call it what it is: magical thinking. To appear as populist, but often these people are often from very, very elite backgrounds. Like, Robert Kennedy's a Kennedy. Trump is in the grand scheme of the American hot bourgeoisie, like nouveau riche, but by no means does he comes from nothing. I find this interesting in that, in some ways, and maybe I'm over concluding here, but there is a way in which like a kind of cultural progressiveness can fall for that.
Can fall for, you mean for the aristocratic thing?
Yeah, the aristocrat that's pretending to be a peasant for you. Like I think about this with Maha is very interesting because there's a lot of people in Maha that if you'd talked to them 10, 15 years ago, they would have told you they were cultural liberals. And that is just not true now. And when I think about who I associated with the anti-vaccine movement in America, the figureheads were mostly culturally progressive. I don't know, they're politically actually progressive, but they were culturally progressive. Now, in the background, I live in Utah. Mormons and various other like conservative religious groups have been behind this the entire time, but the spokespeople for it would have thought that they were progressive. And I find this interesting. Like Castaneda seems to hit on all these kind of cultural contradictions about the way you can kind of play the American upper middle class if you speak to them the right way, even when it's even when it's kind of obvious. But I don't know. I mean,
Castaneda was definitely playing people. I mean, it's, in terms of like his audience, I don't, he did want the approval of people like Garfinkle. He valued the approval of, the high academic intelligentsia. I don't think he gave a shit about his readers. I think that's kind of, because at first, he writes the first book, really for the academics. I think that later, he's very into, kind of game plan on this very kind of high level. And, I think he clearly knew, who, over time, who his audience was, and he had to kind of play to that too. But any kind of sense that he actually really had, respect for that other than as a source of, girls, girls and money. And I would say in his defense, he didn't really care about money. He just needed the money to keep, basically for the women. Well, it's just, there's a chronology, because at the beginning, he's much more, he's aiming high. The later books are just so, I read them as, kind of coded, in some ways as coded confessions, even coded autobiography, very, very convoluted. And they're also them for his in-group. It's like which woman within the, in these, it becomes very much about the women and who's up and who's down. And, Lagorda is a powerful witch, and, and then she's out of the picture, later. That's because there's an actual woman in the group who is, who we call Lagorda, who gets thrown out. How exactly that is supposed to work in terms of, novelistic, it's a very curious way to write novels. But because he was so, it's you have to remember how huge he was. He's on the bestseller list throughout the 70s. And what was true, with his professors about people investing in him, and I'm going to be getting, I think, more of this. People don't like what I'm saying, because there's an emotional investment in these books. And that's, they are, I think, I don't know if they're unique, but they are unusual in the intensity of that, because the books are manipulative, because you start identifying with, there's always this kind of hapless character named Carlos, and he is a good enough writer to construct that kind of, subjective entity in a way that, I certainly could identify with it. If you're any kind of person who is a seeker and who, feels, misunderstood, he's really good at like hooking you into that. And it becomes, it's, people really had a hard time, separating from that. And of course, if you knew him in person, way worse.
Well, I mean, even in your book, it's clear he oozes charisma like that. He's unexplainable without that.
Charisma is really important to be talking about now, to really, I think, I'm a little bit going off book here, but I think to really understand that is not just some kind of, epiphenomena, in politics, but, to center that of like, what's, what is charisma? What's going on with it?
Yeah. One thing I kind of noticed from your book, that I don't know how much you draw this out, but that once he's more or less rejected by academic elites, and it does seem like it's not about money with the academic elites, it's about approval. The sorcery becomes a new source of elitism. I mean, the way he talks about non-sorcerers, which is basically everybody else, is
muggles. I think that's the Harry Potter. You bunch of worthless muggles.
Yeah. Basically calls them apes.
Apes. Yeah.
Do you see that as compensating for the fact he couldn't get elite approval? Do you like what's going on there?
I'm going to try to sketch out something here, which is there's a book. What is it called? It's by a guy named Len Oakes, who's from Australia. He writes about charismatic religious leaders, or maybe just charismatic figures, and he talks about the myth of calling that they have, which is it's because they're people who they cannot because of whatever deep primary kind of ego wound, they cannot reconcile themselves, to just being, a regular person in the world who's going to die. Like, it's hard to reconcile with, but they have a really hard time with it. And at a certain point, they play with the idea that they are a special person, that occurs to them. And then something happens which shows them that, oh, wow, I actually am a special person. And I would say with Carlos, it's, how could he have known that this book he was, he's driving a taxi in Los Angeles. He's basically been dropped out of the grad program, that it's going to become an international fucking bestseller. And that he's going to get away with the whole thing. I believe that reinforces that, I am special thing. And then the I am special becomes, everything becomes about that, and it's just us, us select people, and not you, you muggles, or you Democrats, or, you non-sorcerers, or you apes. So I think there's kind of a psychological internal logic to it. And the more that the world starts pressing, this is just my take, I can't prove it, pressing back on you that, oh, maybe you're actually not special, the more extreme that needs to become. And I would sort of look at what's going on nationally now with that too.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of a last reflection. It's a little bit larger than a question, but it's tied into that.
Reflect.
How much do we see in someone like Castaneda that is very much of its time, the 60s to 70s, the 80s, and maybe it's dying out in the 90s? And how much is this a precursor to larger cultural phenomenon we're going to see after 9/11 and this, internet media turn and increased cultural atomization, etc.? Like, is there a way in which would we read Castaneda as primarily of his time, or does he like prefigure problems that we have now, or maybe both?
The sexy answer, both. It depends how you look at it. I think in terms of the specific content, that's, probably a lot of that is of its time. I think, the kind of underlying dynamic, though, of, reflection and seduction, I think, I hate to say, I think that's kind of eternal. And yeah, and I think there are specific things like what we're talking about, Maha, that you can, that you can trace back. But I think the most important thing is, and especially I think it is much worse in the age of the internet, that, people are isolated, people are lonely, people actually do need meaning, and, a very gifted, charismatic trickster, there's going to be more.
Yeah. I feel like we don't even have a good grasp on how many more there may be. I mean, particularly, I've been thinking about, I work in podcasting and I work in education, and I've done that for a long time. But in the age of the streamer, there are people who have cults of personality for having cults of personality, even. Like, it's like they haven't even pulled the kind of stunt that Carlos Castaneda did. Like, which almost feels respectable that you'd bother pulling a stunt like that.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah. I was commenting to someone that, like, I feel like I live in the age of cults, but the cults are led by people with names like Cat Turd and Destiny.
No, you're touching on, I don't know, but I think you're touching on something really important. It's very easy to set that up now, and I don't think we really understand it that well.
I don't either, but I think your point about charisma, I think we need to start really looking at it more intensely than we have, because you know, and in left world, it's almost anathema to talk about. Like, we don't actually believe it exists, yet we all experience.
Oh, really?
It all the time.
I didn't know, because nobody told me. So,
well, I mean, I move in Marxist left world a lot, and like things that confuse us are like dignity and charisma and anything that we can't immediately tie a class to. But you know, non-economic forms of interpersonal power baffle us.
I'm gonna quote you on that. Yeah.
But it does seem like we really need to think about it. And I don't just mean about like obvious figures, like all these, you know, populist left and right movements that are emerging, et cetera, but also like just the way general society works when you have people who are often like, I think about the kind of person who would have been attracted to late Castaneda. Early Castaneda is a different thing, but late culty Castaneda. And, you know, when I look at general society now, I'm like, well, that's almost everybody. like who isn't alienated at this point in a search for identity and doesn't have like a clear set of immediate lived communities at their back.
Oh my god. Oh my god. Yeah. No, I mean, it's just, and I guess, you know, what I am trying to think through, you know, and other things I'm trying to work on is, you know, just the way how basically, I just don't think you can talk about politics without talking about psychology. That kind of siloing is, you know, it obviously, you know, left and right are still real things, but they're not what they meant. You know, obviously they're not what they meant 30 years ago, or certainly 50 years ago. I'll just end with, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to end on. I am going to finish your book, but what I'm reading right now, I really enjoy. I think it's I hope other people think it's an important book. I think it's an important book.
American Trickster, or books.com, or the other, you know, the other entities that sell books.
Yeah, you can make your pack with whatever Dark Lord you need to, but go buy it.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Where can people find any other work? And is there any, like, now that you finished a 20-year project, is there anything you're working on now?
I have a collection of short stories, if there's and essays, if there's an agent out there listening to this, or, you know, a publisher. Just, I got a bunch of irons in the fire.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. This was great. I'm really great to talk to you and to meet you.
And nice to meet you too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Derek.
Bye.